Good morning. My name is Danielle Ragib. I'm a training and technical assistance specialist on the Medi-Cal Mobile Crisis Training and Technical Assistance Center, known as MTAC. Today, we are bringing you another core required training, which is on crisis safety planning. And so today's training is, again, part of the core required. So there are 5. This is number 4. And the 5th one will be later this month. And just to speak to the BIN a little bit, the Behavioral Health Information Notice, which was updated in June of this year. The benefit does state that mobile crisis services are to provide rapid response and really to support someone stabilizing in the community and work towards resolving their crisis. And so if you've been to a few of our trainings before or our webinar on transformation of care, crisis care here in California, then you know that there is a new direction through this benefit for mobile crisis services. And the goal is really to work towards changing mobile crisis services so that the response is more resolution focused and person centered and provide relief to people in crisis in the community. So really working towards using the least restrictive means necessary and reducing unnecessary use of law enforcement, inpatient psychiatric hospitalizations, and utilizing ER beds. Oops. Again, mobile crisis services should always be person-centered, trauma-informed, equity-driven, and really be more about brief intervention to de-escalate the crisis and resolve it in the moment in the community. And working from that lens of the least restrictive interventions, and as always, be as culturally responsive, linguistically appropriate, and accessible to all. Today, we have some really exciting, amazing presenters for you. I'm very happy that they're here today. We have Dr. Joyce Chu, Dr. Christopher Weaver, and Avery Bellew. And I'm going to hand it off to them so that they can introduce themselves as opposed to reading their bios. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Dr. Joyce Chu. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and a director at Community Connections Psychological Associates, where we do training, evaluation, and consultation around suicide prevention and management. And I'm very, very happy to be here today. I'm also a professor at Palo Alto University, and I have a few different areas of expertise. One of them is in culture and diversity. So I identify as a cultural psychologist, also in community mental health. At Palo Alto University, I direct our diversity and community mental health emphasis. So I train psychologists and other mental health providers to work in counties and in communities. And then the third is as a suicidologist, and happy to be here co-presenting with Avery and Dr. Weaver, Chris, and I'll ping it over to Chris for an introduction.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Weaver. I am also a clinical psychologist by training and trade. I'm a colleague of Joyce's at both Palo Alto University and Community Connections. At PAU, I actually direct our forensic program. So my primary relevant publications and research work has been in mental health law, crisis CIT training. I've co-authored a number of different CIT curricula and have taught in those curricula for a number of years on topics including military veterans, post-traumatic stress disorder, implicit bias, and a number of other things that we may get to discuss or not today. I will, with that, I think, bat it over to my friend Avery.
Hello, all. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Avery Bellew. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a principal at Health Management Associates, HMA. I've been working at the intersection of public health with a focus on suicide prevention and LGBTQIA+ populations for about 15 years. My career includes working as the education director at the Trevor Project, working at the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, SPRC, the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, and most recently at Lambda Legal before I came to HMA, which is a national LGBTQ civil rights organization. And I'm here today participating as someone who has lived experience with suicide and identifies as a suicide attempt survivor.
All right. And so the three of us together are very, very much looking forward to talking with you today about collaborative, culturally responsive crisis safety planning. And we are here to talk about crisis safety planning. So I just want to open up a little bit here with just talking about what is collaborative, culturally responsive safety planning. We really want to think about, in your role as mobile crisis team members, how do you do crisis safety planning in these moments of crisis with your potential clients and community members in a way that's strength-based, in-person centered, and collaborative, in a way that creates psychological safety for someone? Safety planning is essentially something that you can do with some of your clients in the field in order to reduce their risk in the moment. And it, by definition, is something that we want to use as an empowerment tool to empower both families and individuals to avoid and manage crises rather than invoking more escalating services. I know you're getting a lot of different training, some on de-escalation and harm reduction and many different aspects. And safety planning is an evidence-based approach that we're going to be talking about today, and a critical tool that you can use to help actually reduce the risk that you're being faced with as you work with some of those community members out there. It's particularly important for diverse and marginalized individuals, partly because of its ability to be empowering and strength-based. And it also assures a trauma-informed context. And that's something that is particularly in play for folks who have diverse backgrounds, culturally diverse backgrounds, partly because of kind of histories of trauma and isms that folks have experienced. We're going to be covering several different learning objectives today. This is you, mobile crisis team members. We are hoping to help you build skills with collaborative crisis safety planning as a self-empowering tool for folks to avoid, avert, and soothe crisis, both before and as and after they're happening. And we want to understand the potential role and limitations of safety planning in seeking self-seeking resolution through stages of crises. You're going to just practice engaging in that process to craft an individualized safety plan. And we're going to be talking about how you can use a safety plan to guide against iatrogenic harm. So in our role as both providers, peer specialists, community members of mobile crisis teams, we want to mitigate any iatrogenic harm, meaning any harms that can come from anything that we do as mobile crisis team members. And we want to be able to talk about that a little bit. And critical to minimizing iatrogenic harm and having empowering strength-based orientations is to have a culturally infused approach. And we intentionally use the word infused because we want to infuse and emphasize the ways in which culture affects everything that we do when we do safety planning, to really customize care for folks from multiple intersecting cultural backgrounds. So you'll hear us, we have an entire section. It's more of a really an innovation that has a lot of emerging research around how to do that. How do we be culturally responsive? And through that, we are so privileged and lucky to be able to hear from Avery talk about her lived experiences with safety planning as we go through each bit of didactic. So you'll see me, Chris, and Avery ping pong back and forth around that. Would love to just ping it over to Avery to talk about your experiences with crisis safety planning.
Thank you, Joyce. So as Joyce said, I'm going to be popping in throughout as a voice of lived experience. And so I want to share a little bit about kind of my context and history with safety planning. So you all understand kind of my story, and that provides some context as I contribute throughout. So the safety planning experiences that I'm going to describe to you all today occurred across a period of about 13 to 15 years ago. So you have that context. They were with both a mental health therapist, but also with a religious leader in a pastoral care setting, which I think is important to note because we know mobile crisis teams can be made up of folks with various backgrounds, sometimes with mental health therapy and mental health backgrounds, and sometimes not. And then I also want to state, of course, that given my professional background, which I share with you, I've also facilitated safety planning throughout my career. So I have both of those contexts coming into this conversation. So a little bit about me and my context. I am a queer person, and I'm also a transgender woman. My background is that I grew up in a very culturally conservative and rural setting. And I grew up in a closed religious community. I grew up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. When I came out as queer, I experienced severe family and community rejection, something which, according to the research, happens for about 20% of LGBTQ young people and young adults. That severe rejection, the severity of that rejection, alongside, of course, other societal and environmental factors, some of which we'll be talking about today, led to a complex combination of crises for me, including housing insecurity, extreme financial hardship, and ongoing suicidal ideation and a suicide attempt. As I weave my story throughout, I want to stress that every story is unique. So my story is just one story of one transgender person. And I think what's great about this presentation today is you're going to hear another case study of another trans person throughout this presentation that I think will really highlight that, that we can't create macro narratives or oversimplify experiences across entire cultural groups. So hopefully my story being woven throughout alongside another case study of another transgender person will illuminate both some similarities and commonalities, as well as the necessity of being really attentive to each individual person and their story.
All right. Thank you so much, Avery. So as we jump in here, I just want to invite you to reflect. So it's a great thing to do as we start in on didactics and et cetera. And just a reflection question for you on how much prior experience you have with crisis safety planning. Some of you may have extensive experience. Some of you may have none or a little bit. We really hope and aim through the training today to really get everybody on the same page with foundational knowledge about what crisis safety planning is, how do you do it, what is the process, what are the critical components, how do you infuse culture, so that you can go back and take this into your everyday jobs and really start to engage with that process and really engage conversations with your colleagues around what does this look like in your particular team, in your particular locality. I think the process really needs to be a collaborative one. Anytime we're dealing with crisis, the one rule of thumb and actually a standard of care in terms of, taking care of liability is that you never want one mind or one brain on any one particular situation. You want to be working on teams, even if you're working as an individual peer specialist or peer provider or as a team member or a therapist, whatever your role is. You want to consult with others. And so today we're really, we don't want to pretend that you're going to get everything that you're going to get from today. We want to give you everything that you need to know to be able to go back and work with your teams on using crisis safety planning to be able to help your community members and clients.
Getting us started means we are going to start with the kind of basic side of things. And on that basic side, we're going to go through the 6 or 7 steps of the standard safety planning process. Okay, so here is, I'm always a big fan of telling you where I'm going before I go there. So where I'm going is this. There is a standard way to do things. Standard is a critically important thing to know when we're looking at our liability. This is also a key area where when we're doing the right thing for our liability, which is the standard of care, it also can be really good, very patient-centered, very trauma-informed, patient and family-centered care. Okay, so this is a place where the standard of care that's going to help us in terms of the legal expectations of did we do what reasonable clinicians or crisis intervention folks would do, and what's best going to help people actually coincide nicely. So this is a very lovely fit of a topic with the ideas of empowering people and families and trying to stay away from those escalated levels of service. Okay, I want to kind of go next to what safety planning is not. So what safety planning is not, this is different from no suicide contracts. So if you were clinically trained in the era where I was clinically trained, we would do these no suicide contracts. Joyce, you're my client. You're having a hard day today. You've been thinking about suicide. Our session's about to come to an end. I want you to sign this paper just saying that you're going to keep yourself safe until we meet next Thursday. And those are, not surprisingly, there's not a lot of empirical support, which means we don't think they work. They actually, in the end, may create more liability because for some time now, they have been seen as substandard. So if you haven't gotten that message, key important point number one is we should not be doing these anymore. They're not therapeutic. Therapeutic alliance is critically important in de-escalation, in getting folks to follow through with treatment. So doing these does not look good. If I were an expert coming in and looking at a case that has gone wrong, and you had done a no suicide contract with somebody, I would be able to be critical of that because it reflects an outdated standard of care on your part, as opposed to the standard of care, which is the safety plan. And you'll see us talking about crisis safety plan. We're talking about these synonymously out there in the literature. It's just called safety plan, the safety plan. You all are bringing it into the crisis world, and we'll talk about that. And we're going to teach it in that way today. But this is the standard safety plans. So there are a couple of citations there, but there are tons of articles all over the literature about the effectiveness of the safety plan that has even kind of come up and morphed a little bit since those original publications. This is the standard of care out there. It is reasonable to expect that at some point in the levels of care, if I come in crisis, someone will do a safety plan with me. It doesn't mean it's necessarily you as an individual, your responsibility to do that. But if someone in the system hasn't done a safety plan with me and I've been in crisis and something goes wrong, that is going to be fairly easy for someone to suggest as negligent in terms of having done this. Safety plans have six parts, and we're going to morph these a little bit, but there really are variations on the parts. The idea of this is that this is something that is discussed with the client. That's the collaborative piece. There are lots of different clever ways to record this down. The goal always being that the client is leading the way, both in terms of generating content and recording content and critiquing content. But the content areas are the six up here. So first is going to be warning signs. What is happening to me before I come into crisis? 2 is going to be coping strategies. We will see this sometimes as specified internal, external coping strategies, and we're going to encourage us today some foreshadowing of the culturally adapted approach to not narrow ourselves to where the coping strategies need to come from. It turns out that whether something is internal or external is very much a Western-centric idea. So some folks may look at one intervention and feel it's on one side of that or the other. The solution is just thinking about this as coping strategies. 3 is social contacts and settings that can provide distraction for me. So this is getting away from my head. My kids say, touch grass. I need to stop playing video games and go touch grass. What is it that is going to be the people that can get me out there and get me distracted versus number 4, people who I can go ask for help. So these will be people that I can disclose the problems that I have. They're not just there for distraction. I can have deeper conversations around these things for them. As opposed to number 5, which is professionals I can contact during a crisis. Okay, so this will somewhat include you all out there in your roles as in mobile crisis. It can also include and should include hotlines. It can include people's individual therapists or counselors or faith counselors or healers. And again, all of this is going to be driven by them. The last component is going to be making the environment safe. So how do we get it to where the place where you are, both in terms of triggers, but also in terms of, say, if suicide is part of the picture for you, how do we get your place physically safe? Those are going to be the 6 components. And if you're new to safety planning, again, the idea is that this is going to be a thing that we sit down, go through these 6 component categories, and we're doing this with a patient so that they can tell us what's working or not going to work for them. We may very well help them broaden their brainstorming about ideas. We may absolutely be bringing other options for professionals, ideas for making the environment safe, and helping them brainstorm within their own within their own resources. But we are not going to push something on them other than things that they would be able to agree with. Okay, so let's start and go through each of these in turn. So if we're starting off with warning signs, here are some questions that you can ask that will kind of prompt this content area. What do you notice is different about you when you're distressed or heading into a crisis? Okay, I'm arguing with my parents. I get in a fight with my husband. It's around midterms and finals time at college. It's after the holidays, after my kids leave town, and I know I'm not going to see them again for another year. So it's whatever it is that will help putting somebody in some awareness of the ABC of the antecedent behavior consequence chain for the fellow behaviorists out there. Coping strategies, and again, we're not going to specify external or internal. You will see people specify external, internal. More on that later. We encourage you to think and let people think broadly about this. Coping strategies is the idea of, well, what's helped you cope when you felt distressed? And for me, for example, it's listening to really loud metal rock music, right? Which would probably enrage or endanger a number of people on the call today, right? So for one person's coping strategies cannot be everybody's coping strategies. Some of you all will probably go listen, to some very nice classical music, which would just push me over the edge, right? So you're gonna let me develop or come up with what it is that's going to work for me. What things have I found helpful to distract myself? Some people's distraction is other people's infuriation, right? So we're really going to let them guide that to that. We want to be able to push these things. Hey, are you going to be able to do that when this crisis thing starts to happen? Is that really going to be a viable thing? Can you really go mini golfing when you're driving down the road in a fury because you've had this argument with your parents? Is mini golfing really going to be the solution for us in that situation? And really pushing them and testing that. And I think helping them become aware that a good plan is also subject to some failure, right? And that's okay. It doesn't make the planning a bad idea. It just means that we're going to have to iterate on this thing. A key component that also pops up in this is reasons for living. So at the state of affairs right now in the literature is we pretty much understand that reasons for living is a really critically important coping strategy to be able to think about what it is, why it is that I would be here. And you need go no further than YouTube and look up military veterans suicide dog, and you will see stories about who look like these hardened, grizzled military vets. The guy that's got the record for the longest sniper kill in OIF, and he was about to take his own life when his tiny little dog popped its head up over the seat, and he just thought, I can't leave my dog. And that was just what worked for him. Okay, so with that, let me stop talking a little bit. I have talked too much. Let me show a bit of a vision or a view from the experts. So we actually have some videos here we're going to show. The first here is Dr. Brown of Stanley Brown fame. And this is him getting into the first part of a safety plan with a patient.
The following videos show an interaction between a clinician and a patient in which the safety planning intervention is being used to help keep the patient safe after discharge from the healthcare organization. There are 4 videos, each showing a different part of the safety planning intervention.
Hi, Mike. I'm Dr. Brown. I'm a psychologist here at the hospital, and I've been asked to see you given your recent suicide attempt by overdose. And so what I'd like to do today is hear your story, what led up to the attempt, and then we can put our heads together and think of some things that we can do that might be helpful to you. So tell me what happened. What led up to the overdose?
I've been struggling for a long time, depression. And, just haven't felt energetic or like, and it was really starting to bother my wife. I wasn't helping with the kids or getting the chores done that I said I was going to do. And we got in a big fight last night, and she decided she needed to go somewhere where there'd be support, and that meant leaving. And, I really felt like a failure. And, if I'm really that big a burden to my family, just really the pain really just got to me. So I had some painkillers left over from a knee operation, and, I guzzled them.
Mm-hmm. And so you overdosed on some painkillers, and then what happened?
Well, she had left the house to cool down, I guess, or whatever, and came back, and she clearly knew something was wrong. And I told her what I'd done, and she called an ambulance, and they came and got me to the hospital, and they did whatever.
How do you feel about being here?
Glad I'm alive, but ashamed. Glad I'm here.
I'm glad you're here too. It's really good you're willing to talk with me and get some help. Thank you for telling your story. I want to make sure I understand you, so I'm going to just summarize a little bit of the main points that I heard.
Okay.
And I'm going to write them down on this piece of paper. And we have what's called a suicide risk curve, which is risk here and time here, usually in hours. So it started off with your wife getting into an argument and saying she was going to leave.
Yeah.
And then you felt like a failure.
Yep.
And then you felt like your family was giving up on you.
Yeah, for sure.
And then you had a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And that led to you taking the overdose. And then your wife ended up intervening and took you to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And then you feel ashamed about being here, but you're glad nothing bad happened.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
And if you look at this suicide risk curve, you see how the risk escalates to the point that you wanted to take your life, and then it kind of de-escalates, or the risk comes back down.
Okay.
So it kind of comes and goes, right?
Yeah.
And so this is really important, because if we can get you to recognize your warning signs when the curve starts to escalate, and then what you can do to prevent this from going to the top, that's going to help get you through a crisis. Okay?
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. So one of the ways we do this is by filling out what's called a safety plan.
Okay.
The safety plan is a document that includes your warning signs and some coping strategies to help you get through this kind of rough period.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep.
You can see it has 6 steps, and the first step is identifying your warning signs. And from your story, what do you think your warning signs were?
Feeling like a failure,
Mm-hmm.
being a burden to my family.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and that pain for sure.
And pain. Do you think those are good warning signs? Like if you experience them again, that you will know you're in a crisis?
Yeah, I think so.
You think they'd be helpful for identifying when the crisis is beginning?
Yeah.
And when you experience a warning sign, that means that you're to pull out your safety plan.
Okay.
Okay?
Makes sense.
So we're going to fill out the rest of this together, as a team. Both of us kind of working on this, put our heads together.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep.
Okay.
The scenario you just watched is common for clinicians in emergency departments and other acute care services. The conversation between the clinician and the patient was structured to present the patient with the option of having a safety plan that includes strategies that the patient comes up with that can be used to head off a future crisis that could lead to another suicide attempt. In the next video, you can listen in on how this patient and the clinician develop a safety plan together.
All right, so there it is from the expert. We're going to see more of that coming up in a bit. We won't watch all of those. The link is in the chat though, so you have all of there are 4 videos in there. We're going to watch the first and the fourth, but you can see the other ones. We're going to focus on those 2 today. A really good resource to go through. It's feeling like, as I see him in his style, that looks to me like a very comfortable, slow pace that rings of a 1 or 2 hour therapeutic meeting, which may far exceed in luxury what you have to spend with folks. So you may be having to flavor this and get things more quickly or get pieces over time. So that's not lost on me. For those of you who are there saying, yeah, I don't have that kind of time with folks, I think we're still looking at of the time that you have, how are you spending it, and working away at a safety plan would be a good use of time for a number of different reasons. Moving on then to the next piece. Oh, we've done our videos. Dr. Brown. So going through with folks the social contacts and settings that can provide distraction. Now, again, this may be where someone may say, oh, my sister has always known about all of my stuff, so she's who I call. And we're going to coach them and say, no, that's different. This is a different thing where we actually want folks like, who's somebody who has no idea what goes on with you, but you all go play basketball, or you all go play tennis, or you all get together for D&D night, or whatever it is that distracts you and gets you out of your head for a while. How do you do that? Next up then would be people I can ask for help. So that sounds like a good place where we might want to put your sister. So your sister is someone who you could reach out to. Is your sister ever involved in these crises? Is it ever a case that your sister's someone who you're mad at? And so we're going to want to make sure that we generate other options, getting into that kind of stuff. And this might be where they say, well, I could call you guys again, or I could call my therapist. And we're going to say, well, hold that thought, right? Because that's coming up. But we really want to separate these out so that you have all of these levels of reaching out for care available to you. So yep, next up is the professionals I can contact during a crisis. So what is this is a place where someone may say, you know, I've tried therapy and I don't like it. It's like, okay, we don't have to just talk about those folks. Let's talk to you about hotlines. You can call hotlines and they can help you do this. Well, I don't like that. They don't know me. You know, I have, you know, that's just, it's not for me, it's for other people. I don't like the VA hotline. I'm a veteran, but I don't like the VA hotline. Well, okay, here's some other hotlines that are available to you. Or I'm not a veteran, but I don't like the 988 hotline. Okay, you know, so you know, do you have any, you can also call the one that's out there for military veterans. They also know about general resources that are out there. Or someone who may be hesitant because of their identities, cultural, ethnic, gender identity, or otherwise, to access care. And you can say, hey, you know what? There are specific hotlines out there for you that may speak in different languages, may know specific gender affirming options for care. So this is the place too where we will, our job is to know how a big buffet of resources that we could lay out for people so that they can come along and say, that one looks good to me. And that's a big piece of fleshing out this professionals I can contact beyond 911 emergency room therapist. Okay. Next up, we're going to get into one of the more interesting pieces of this, which is actually the last piece, making the environment safe. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to my friend Joyce for a little bit here.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to share one slide on just some national resources, some California resources on that portion of professionals I can contact during a crisis. So, for example, CalHope is a great resource for some numbers and et cetera within California. There's some California counties in terms of access and crisis lines, one place to be able to list those. That one might be, that link may be having a little bit of trouble. We'll look into that if it's not working for you, and we'll follow up. But also just remember that, the national hotline where you can call or text 988 is something that you want to be able to give to folks, and give that as a standard crisis resource for anybody. They can call 988, they can text 988 at any time of the day, 24 hours, 7 days a week, as well as a resource on Suicide Awareness Voices of Education has some really great information and resources for them there. And then also, 911, of course, is there for use in imminent danger or when there's a medical safety concern. What we're trying to do, of course, with mobile crisis is to avert anyone from 911. So if mobile crisis can be able to handle it, prevent something a little more upstream, then we'd love to be able to avoid using 911. But it's also important when you're doing safety planning to let people know that that's an option, because some people don't actually know that they can call 911 in a crisis. That's not a cardiovascular event or a heart attack. And so for those of you who are licensed out there, it actually is something that is a standard of care issue that will protect your liability, to let them know that they do have this access to emergency resources during times of crisis. And of course, you would want to give them access to your mobile crisis team as well, and to write that down on the safety plan so they have it in one place. What Chris was referring to, this last part, this is part number 6. And of course, we are saying, some folks say this reasons for living card is number 7. So for some folks say that safety planning actually includes 7 components. Chris and I typically put reasons for living under coping strategies. But this 6th component, this last component of making the environment safe, here are a couple standard questions that you can ask, which is there anything that you have access to or that you've thought of using to attempt suicide or kill yourself? And how can we work together to make yourself more safe so that it's harder for you to immediately access that firearm during a time of crisis? What we want to do is when they're on that risk arc and they're at the kind of the peak of the crisis, and crisis is escalating, we don't want them to be able to easily in a moment of impulse or a moment of elevated risk that may be able to be resolved quickly, to be able to suddenly be able to access something that they can use to attempt suicide. And that's partly around making the environment safe. You can also think about that broadly as how do you make the environment safe so that when I'm in an elevated crisis state, that this environment is safe for me to be in, that we don't want someone to be in a context that's actually making their crisis worse. And so one of the things that we talk about in this making the environment safe is something called means restriction counseling. And I want to talk about some main means restriction counseling principles, because we do think that this is something that you can do as a mobile crisis team member in these moments of crises. Typically, means restriction counseling includes 2 parts, and it's actually pretty straightforward. One, you want to know whether or not they have access to something that they can use to attempt suicide. So that's the first part, assess access. 2 is that you want to work with your clients or your community members and their supports to limit access to lethal means until they're no longer suicidal. And you don't want to do it in a way that's necessarily taking away their control or disempowering them. Again, remember that safety planning is most effective when it is empowering for the individual. So things, for example, you can discuss multiple options to give the person a sense of control and maintain that feeling of freedom. And you want to ideally collaborate with them to agree to say, in your moments of crisis and you're seeing red, you're in crisis, you're seeing red. How can you make the choice to make yourself safe, to be able to plan for your own safety? So you want them to be collaborating that process to actually make their environment more safe with respect to firearms, medications, alcohol, whatever their particular choice of means is. Part of that principle is increasing the distance between the person and their chosen means. The reason for that is that you can effectively prevent a suicide death by helping them ride the waves of crisis. So that suicide risk arc, that comes in waves, just very much like, waves in an ocean. It goes up and then it goes down. Kind of what goes up will come down, right? And so if you can keep them safe during the peak of that crisis, it will come down and you will have effectively prevented a suicide death. And when you increase the distance between me and my chosen means, and I have to figure out extra steps to figure out how to delay access, for example, if in the video that gentleman talked about access to his medications, if his medications are in smaller proportions, in proportions that won't cause serious death or serious physical harm, and then he were to give a portion of his medications to someone else. And same thing with alcohol. If he didn't have access to huge amounts of alcohol where he could have alcohol poisoning, but instead his stash of alcohol is kept locked away, or it's with somebody else that he trusts, one of his supports, then he'd have to take extra steps in a moment of crisis to be able to access a huge amount of alcohol or medications. That is increasing the distance between himself and his means, and effectively getting through that crisis without giving him immediate access. And there's a lot of evidence and research that has shown that this can be effective. Same thing with on a larger, more public health basis. When rural areas of China, for example, have a particular means of pesticides and poisoning, if you restrict access to that, then you can actually see suicide deaths go down. One option that you can consider using is that of a means receipt. So a means receipt is something that you would give to, it would work together to give to somebody that you're doing a safety plan with, where you're restricting access to their lethal means, but you're putting down on paper that, hey, this is the plan. Here's your name. This is your support that's helping us to reduce access to lethal means. Oftentimes, this is an area where you're not just working with a person, but their supportive other can be really important in working with means restriction. And so you're writing down that supports person. You're saying, what is the type of means? Like if it's medication, say, hey, my friend Chris here is going to help me remove access to lethal amounts of my medication. I'm going to write his name on it. And then we're removing it or we're securing it. And what are my safety measures to keep me from being able to access a huge amount of that medication during a time of a crisis? And then when can I get it back? So my friend Chris here is part of my support team. And when I know that all of my warning signs and my state of crisis is more stabilized and I'm further along in my recovery process, he's going to give it back to me. And that's going to be critical in keeping my sense of agency, my sense of empowerment, my sense of control, so that I can feel more on board and have that be a part of a plan that I feel like I am initiating. The benefits is that, it emphasizes that the plan and the suicidal distress is temporary in nature. So not only is the removing the access to my medications temporary in nature, but hey, I've written it down and I've worked with my crisis team member to recognize that I won't feel like this all of the time, and that I can actually recover and feel better. That this not only is this means restriction temporary, but my crisis and my feeling this way and my pain can also be temporary. And in that way, this means receipt can encourage hope for improvement. I won't need this means restriction plan forever. So this is something that you can use as a really nice tool for you. I want to ping it back to Chris to talk about firearms in relation to means restriction.
So just a little bit more about me. So I grew up, I'm not from here. I probably dropped a couple y'alls on y'all, and you can say like, wait a second, he's not from here. And I'm not from California originally. I am from a place where firearms are very common. They are expected. If you showed up at your friend's house, you can tell how wealthy they are kind of by how many guns are in the gun cabinet, none of which was locked. I also grew up in, father was career law enforcement. So also just grew up around firearms, was isolated and rural enough to kind of be ignorant that there was anything else out there until later on in life. So for thing number one, I want to say about firearms is we overemphasize firearms. Okay, and I'm about to do some more of that. So I'm about to commit the offense that I'm accusing us of here, because there is no denying the lethality of firearms. There are not a lot of folks who make a second attempt when first attempt is by firearm, because firearms most likely to result in death as a first attempt. We are going to learn later on in the training here that for some groups of people, say older adult Asian Americans, we need to be more worried about things like ligature, which are even more difficult and challenging to restrict means to. And we're going to focus a little bit on firearms here because of the fact that Joyce and I were in a training years ago now. One of the attendees was I'm going to guess social worker or psychologist, and she near the end of our training said, "Oh my God, I am firearms illiterate and my clients are at risk because of it." And we thought, you know what, there's some validity to that. You know, it's not something that we study. I don't remember a firearm safety class in grad school, that's for sure. And it's something that I think I could look most of you in the eye with your chosen field of work here and say, that wouldn't be a bad idea to go have, or at least have somebody on the team that can do that. Thing number two I'm going to say is, let's please recognize firearms ownership as potentially a heavily culturally loaded variable, or an important piece of my culture. If I own firearm, for some people who own firearms, that is a deep-rooted intrinsic part for their identity as a cultural being. And we need to give honor. We will do better crisis management with them if we give honor to that, those beliefs of theirs as a culture. That then tells us that we need to watch a couple of things. If I culturally can align with that, I might be a particularly useful person on the team. It's why I am the person that I get handed off to talk about the firearm stuff. If you are culturally, if you can culturally align with that, doesn't mean you have to agree, but if you can culturally align with that firearms ownership, you might want to make that known to your team and say, hey, I can have the gun talk with folks. Okay, if you're law enforcement, if you're military veterans, if you can go to them and say, hey, I have firearms, and you know what, it's not helping anybody right now if your firearm causes your death. So let's talk about what we're going to do here, not in the spirit of guns are bad and let's get rid of guns, but in the spirit of I want you to have this for yourself for the right reasons and the right things, not the wrong things. Recommendation number one is always having people not bring the firearms to you. But FYI, there are other things in here. And remember, what we're trying to do is just put a couple of more beats between I have this impulsive thought of I want to hurt somebody or I want to hurt somebody else, right? You'll hear a lot of our talk today is around suicide. If we meet each other again for the de-escalation training, we've got the same curve, okay, for the escalation training. That curve that goes up to a peak of crisis is the curve for suicide. It's the curve for verbal abuse, spousal abuse. It's the curve for so many things, because the curve is basically neurology, right? It is someone getting agitated past the point of the frontal lobe running the show, and then eventually tires out and the frontal lobe comes back in and kicks in and can take back control of stuff. So all of these things are really just ideas to put some space and time in between I have this impulsive thought and I pull the trigger, okay? And we'll see an ad campaign It's a very effective public access ad campaign just to this point. Firearms can be taken apart. A critical piece of it can be given to somebody. Okay, you don't have to give the entire firearm to somebody. You could just give the part that's called the receiver, or a barrel, or the clip, or the ammo. You can lock up your firearm and give somebody else the key. Okay, and you could say to someone, you know, you can always bust that safe open in an emergency, but let's have that as just a little bit of a pause between you and any impulsive thoughts. Do not, again, have the folks bring the gun to you. If you're in their place or not in their place, having them bring it to you is just a general it's a recommendation of don't do. Some of you may be out there making plans and decisions to alter that or change that, but that would be something to be done very thoughtfully and very effortfully. If you do end up with a firearm, contacting authorities and transferring it to them as soon as possible would be an important and prudent piece of that. Now let's talk a little bit about California laws around firearm transfers. And you've got the link there. The second bullet point down there below is the link to the California law that governs this right now. There's a California law that says firearms can be temporarily transferred in the situation where we are trying to prevent a death by suicide. Okay, so that's you can read the law, the technicalities of the law. It's up circa 2020, so about 3.5 years now. The reason why we're also saying we really recommend that you confer and collaborate with your local law enforcement agencies around this. If you're about to go out and say like, hey, it's fine, you can just give your firearms to your friends if it's to prevent suicide, we really want you to kind of confer and collaborate with your local agencies, because of the dozen or so agencies that we actively collaborate with, none of them teach to do this. So the law is new enough that it probably would be a successful defense should you get in trouble for handing a firearm to somebody without an official transfer. You probably don't want to be recommending that people do something that gets them in the situation of having to mount a defense. So just letting folks know that kind of thing. It also probably has implications for things like your documentation. Be a very helpful thing if you could leave somebody with a document that says, we, the mobile crisis team, recommend that you have a friend or family member keep your firearms for you. Then they give the firearms to the friend or family member. The friend or family member gets caught or stopped or gets seen with those firearms, and someone says you shouldn't have those, and they go, it's okay, it was for preventing a suicide, and someone says prove it, and they can show your documentation, that's helpful, right? So just leaving folks with some documentation that says we are recommending that you invoke this law, Penal Code 27882, and that you reference that and maybe even store that with the firearms. I can imagine a day where maybe we have, inexpensive plastic gun locks that we could hand out to you all, and you could, it says, 7288 or 27882 on it, and you could put those on the firearms while you're there in the house, and they could give it away, and that would be a way of documenting that, right? So it's a new thing. Most of the law enforcement folks who we say, why aren't we teaching this more actively and openly yet? They say it's untested. And in legal terms, what that means is we have yet to have somebody get arrested for transferring the firearm under this California Penal Code and then successfully defend it using that penal code. So again, in the spirit of not being the first, we're just letting you know the entire complication of the situation here. Safe storage is this idea that there's a lot out there about safe storage. The evidence basis just says, hey, even if I'm just keeping firearms in a safe way, then this is actually evidence-based to slow down things enough to put a few more beats between my impulsive thought and the pulling of that trigger to actually help with preventing suicide and other crises. So this is things like the storing ammunition and firearms separately, using locks or lock storage, just a number of different things that are good firearms safety. From inside the culture of people who have firearms for including, among other things, protection. Just so you know, when you're asking somebody to slow down access to their firearm, that's a bit of a thing. That's a bit of a big ask. If my vision of how I'm using these firearms is I have a burglar breaking in, and in the seconds it takes them to get to my bedroom, I can have myself armed and safe, and you're asking me to lock it away in a separate bedroom, that's a big deal. Okay, so again, just speaking to the culture of the differences in how I may think about these things versus the person I'm in front of may be thinking about these things, it's really important to think about. In poking around at this, I found a reasonably new ad campaign that I want to show you, and it's there on the links there on the bottom of the PowerPoint. But they've also got a number of different versions of this. Here's a 60-second version, but let me just show you this ad campaign from the VA, which is designed by veterans for veterans. So very much from within a for lack of a better word, pro firearm culture, just talking about this issue. I also love this video because it really gets at some of the issues of veterans as a cultural group. Okay, so we're going to get a kind of a double hit here of things that are kind of culturally veteran laden, with also this ad campaign for safe storage.
Hey, you made it. Come on in.
Are you sick of hollow gestures and meaningless nods of understanding?
I know you've been through.
Are you tired of being repeatedly thanked and told you're a hero, while you feel like a liability?
Thank you for your service.
Crisis can happen unexpectedly to anyone. And though it may seem like a small barrier, a simple lock puts space between the thought and the trigger. Learn how securing your guns can help prevent suicide.
And that's it. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's just quick and simple, and makes a connection with folks, and then says, hey, this safe storage thing, let's talk about it. It puts it on the table. So FYI, I love that video and that campaign, and really recommend it. Another thing that I like to show folks, and I want to give it to you as a tool. So Joyce and I teach this as when you're managing the suicide risk of a kid in a household, you're also managing the suicide risk of the household and vice versa, right? So when you're managing suicide risk of an adult in the household, you're managing suicide risk or crisis risk for a lot of other people in that household. In suicide terms, it's the idea of contagion, right? That when suicide attempts or deaths happen, they can tend to spread. Just in the spirit of this, in the context of firearms, we've talked about removal. We've talked about, I haven't talked actually much about prevalence. Just FYI about prevalence. For anybody who is thinking, well, not in this county, not in San Francisco County. We don't have guns in San Francisco County. That was the spirit that motivated a study that we did at UCSF at the inpatient unit, where we started systematically asking, hey, do you own or have access to firearms? And we went from about 1 person in 100 who we thought had access to a firearm to about 1 person in 10 who had access to firearms in central San Francisco. Okay, so if you, to the degree that you think you're in a culture where guns aren't a thing, what probably also increases with that is the degree to which people don't disclose that they have firearms. Okay, so that's, you have to ask and you have to know prevalence is much higher. And then in terms of kids and guns, this is the video that I like to show, and I want to show it to you so that you can show it to other parents. You know, my kids would never get into my guns, or my kids would never play around with a gun, or my kids are scared of the guns, or anything like that. So there are a number of different versions of this video. You've got the link to the one that I'm going to show here. This gets replayed in the media every once in a while, but I just want to show you this video. The punchline of this video is kids are super fascinated with guns, and they can work them and use them and point them in very dangerous ways, even kids that aren't around firearms. So this I think might be a tool for you if you're trying to push some firearms means restriction in a household that has kids and the parents are kind of in denial about how dangerous it could be for the kids.
Oh my God.
You would have this reaction too if you just saw what these parents did. That's 5-year-old Adam. He just picked up a gun and pointed it at his friend. Don't worry, the gun is not real. It's part of an experiment with a gun expert to find out how kids would react if they found a gun while playing.
In tonight's When It Happens to You, our Christina Coleman talks with parents who've just watched their children find a gun and learn what to do with it.
Hey, all right, come on in. Look at all these toys.
Whoa,
Okay, I'm gonna let you guys go ahead and play.
Play dates when you're a kid? There's nothing better. Toys aside, this get-together isn't just about fun. It's an experiment using 2 rooms, 8 cameras, 6 microphones, and a half a dozen guns that look like the real thing, hidden for these little ones to find. It doesn't take long.
Oh my gosh.
3-year-olds Nick and Faith, along with 5-year-old Adam and 6-year-old Gabriel, make up Group 1. While it's make-believe, in real life, this kind of curiosity kills our kids.
So when people say kids can't rack firearms,
You just put it right to his face.
3 out of the 4 kids didn't just pick up the guns, they played with them.
Very emotional seeing that. Even when you know that it's fake and you know it's not real, it's like they put that down and then pick up another toy. It's just like a toy to them.
Up next, group number 2.
Look at all these toys. You guys can play with whatever you want.
fluffies.
4-year-old DW, 5-year-old Winston, and Carson, who's 6. Their playtime ended quickly. Carson picked up the gun and Winston ran for help.
He's gonna leave the room.
he left the room. That's very good, very good, very good.
Oh, then that just made me proud. Like I want to cry.
That's exactly what we wanted.
Firearm instructor Stephen King owns Metro Shooting Supplies and is a former police officer.
The firearm has to be secured. This is another very inexpensive safe. This is $25. You just stick your gun in here, secure it.
As for little DW, toys kept him busy, but in real life, he could have been an easy target.
And that's probably going to be the victim in a situation because they're oblivious to what's going on around them because they're playing with toys.
That was so scary.
After the experiment, King urged parents to talk to their kids about guns.
You don't have firearms in your home and you don't let them play with them, and yet they knew exactly what to do with them. So they're seeing it from television, video games, cartoons, something, they're seeing those things.
Well, they look so real, so I'm just imagining them being real and the effects that can happen if one were to go off.
Where we're in 3 to 5 years old here, they don't comprehend death.
Ooh, some guns! Guns, guns, guns!
So with a firearm, when you see that, you need to stop, don't touch it, leave the area and go tell mom or dad.
King says it's easy for kids to accidentally pull a gun's trigger.
They don't know if they're loaded, they don't know how they work, they don't know anything about them.
Now, they do. An experiment in gun safety that left a lasting impression on parents.
But there's just more of that continues. There are older versions of these studies. They show the same thing from way back where the video is clearly from the 90s. You know, they're just clearly long-standing videos of understanding how kids get fascinated by firearms, and showing that can be super powerful. On that note, it's a little unnerving, a little nerve-wracking.
So as you get resituated, we wanted to be able to talk through, we'll just remind you, kind of review where we are right now. So we've reviewed all 6 to 7 portions of a standard safety planning process, crisis safety planning process. And we wanted to ping over to Avery here to share a little bit about her lived experience. And I'm just going to read out a few prompts so that Avery can reflect on some of these aspects. So one, Avery, I just really wanted to ask you to talk about a few things. Whether or not anybody from a mobile crisis team has ever done a crisis safety plan with you, whether that be a therapist or was that a peer. And in your experience, how can iatrogenic harms, meaning harms that are caused by someone doing a safety plan, for example, or interacting with you during that process, how can iatrogenic harms come from different stakeholders when they attempt to facilitate crisis safety planning? And then also, how can crisis safety planning be an empowering process that can create psychological safety. And we'd love to hear your perspectives.
Awesome. Thank you, Joyce. So as I shared at the beginning, I had engaged in safety planning a couple different times, once with a mental health therapist and another time with a pastor who had received training, thankfully, around how to do safety planning. So have kind of both of those experiences in the back of my mind as I think about these questions. And I'm going to flip them and talk a little bit about how it can be empowering, and then talk a little bit about harm that can occur. So from the empowering perspective, I would say that at a macro level, the feeling that you're providing through a safety planning process that you're not alone. And I loved in the video that we watched, the words that the clinician used was, "We're going to do this together." And so I think at a macro level, the feeling that you're coming alongside someone, you're accompanying them as they think about their next steps, that they have someone with them on their side in the journey, is really a deeply meaningful feeling that comes out of a safety planning process. The other thing I would say is when you're in a crisis, as I'm sure many of you can relate to from working with people in crisis or from maybe experiencing crisis yourself, it can be very hard to organize your thoughts. It often feels like every component of your life is spinning out of control simultaneously. Whether or not that's true, and sometimes it is, in my instance and in my story, in fact, was true, given my kind of context of why I was in crisis, it can be very hard to organize your thoughts. And so one of the other benefits, I think, the empowering benefits of safety planning is that it actually helps someone in crisis to do just that, to organize their thoughts, to take stock of resources they have at their disposal, and helps them think in an organized fashion, which is really an enormous gift to someone who's experiencing a crisis, can produce a feeling of being in control when so many things are out of control or may feel like they're out of control. The third way that I would say it's empowering is that it helps someone to start to create a narrative arc about who they are and what they're capable of. So particularly given, context about why someone might be in crisis. So as you remember me sharing at the beginning of our session together, that I'm transgender, I'm queer. So my context is part of a minority group who often experiences people telling stories about us. Who we are. Trans people are known to be at higher risk for suicide. Some individuals blame trans people for having mental health crisis. And so part of what happens in safety planning is you start to learn how to tell your own story, both about who you are, who your community is, and you start to identify that you have control over your own narrative. And that's another real gift of the safety planning process, is that you have control over your narrative, and you can start building a new story, even if maybe negative stories have been told about you because of your identities or your social context. For me and my example, it started helping me realize that I was a problem solver. I did have some really big problems to overcome, but it helped me to start thinking about how I could solve those problems, that I had control over which social groups I joined, that I could seek out social groups that were going to accept me as a trans person, as a queer person, and that I had control over doing that. So those are all things that were empowering and good. And I do want to take a moment to talk about harm, because I think this is a really, really important point, and I'm glad it's a question in this section. So one harm can come from assuming that we might understand the person's circumstances that we're working with to build a safety plan, either because we share some identities with them and some experiences. Sometimes that relating to them can be good, but it also can cause harm, or because we feel like we have read so much or understand so much about a particular population or group that we can anticipate what their life circumstances might be like. So to illustrate this, in my example, one of the individuals who did a safety plan with me was my therapist. My therapist was a lesbian, so part of the LGBTQ community, like I was myself. My therapist shared my experience of having religious trauma, of having had really negative experiences with religious community. And part of my crisis, my mental health crisis, was caused by really significant harm caused within the context of religious community. Because my therapist shared that some identity with me and experience with me, she mistakenly assumed that when she was doing safety planning with me, religion and religious community would not be a source of support. She kind of even asserted that obviously that's not where you want to go for support. That's a source of harm. What was true for me, however, is that I had started accessing religious communities that were affirming of who I was. I had many of my sources of individual support as well as kind of communal support. I had a pastor that I was talking to. Those were actually really important sources of support. What happened for me was I felt like I had to hide that from the person doing the safety plan with me. I didn't feel comfortable telling them that those were actually sources of support for me because of the assumptions that were made. And that's an experience I've thought about a lot, both as I've done safety planning with others, how I don't want to assume because of my experiences what might be true for them. And I think that's a really a real life example that illustrates that beautifully. The second thing I will say, and I'll end on this around harm, it can also come from not really doing deep listening about what is true for that person in that moment. The way that I experienced harm as it relates to this was that in my experience, which probably is a minority experience, I had experienced such a degree of social isolation because I was raised in a very, as I shared, an insular community that rejected me when I came out as queer and trans. The degree of separation from that community was so severe that when we got to the part of the safety plan around social context and settings and people, I had almost nothing there. It was almost blank. And that might be a really kind of unusual circumstance, but perhaps not so much for certain people in the LGBTQ community. And the experience I had more than once is having to convince someone doing a safety plan with me that, in fact, I did not have anyone to put in those components of a safety plan, that I was literally going to have to build from the ground up. So you can imagine someone in crisis having to convince the person trying to help them about the severity of their context and their circumstances. That adds additional stress. And so I think that's another place where harm can sometimes unintentionally occur, is sometimes assuming that someone might be exaggerating their context of their crisis and how severe certain parts of their context might be. So I think, as we saw modeled really beautifully in the video, approaching this really from a neutral position, that you're there to accompany, to listen, to walk alongside someone, to ask questions in a way that are open-ended questions and without judgment, is actually what's going to lead you to that place of empowerment.
Thank you so much, Avery. That's so powerful and so fascinating to just hear about your own experiences of things that have been both empowering and then things that didn't work for you as you navigated your own crisis recovery process. And really look forward to hearing more from you around that. So thank you so much. What we wanted to kind of talk about is you could hear through Avery's story, you could see how the safety planning was just so essential to be a collaborative process. And there were some instances where she had to hide what was actually going on with her, or her ability to be able to genuinely share with the person who was doing safety planning with her. And so we want to talk about a bit of that process. So at this point in the training and the workshop, you know all of the main aspects of what a safety plan should include. And I'll also include address a couple of the Q&A at this point. One person asked in Q&A, Donnie Jimenez, as an unlicensed staff member, when do we refer to a clinician during a crisis safety plan? I just want to say that anybody, it's not just somebody who's in a therapist role or someone who's licensed that can do safety planning. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that has looked at, for example, emergency room staff members who are unlicensed or they're not mental health clinicians, and they're able to do safety planning in an effective way that mitigates crisis, that mitigates risk within the time that somebody's in an emergency room. And so you can actually, as a staff member and a crisis worker, do the entire safety planning process with somebody in the field. There's also some evidence to show that even if you are, for one reason or the other, you're not able to do all of the components, even though that is the ideal. We want to encourage everybody to do the entire safety planning process. It is still effective if you're not able to do every single aspect. So we know, and we all know collaboratively, that you're working within different limitations in the field, and you're going to need to work with your team members and collaborate and consult and et cetera about what does this look like for you in different crisis situations with different clients and different community members. But you can, if you're an unlicensed staff member, you can absolutely do this whole process. That said, you in the field as a mobile crisis team member probably aren't going to be able to be a partner with somebody as they completely recover and engage in treatment. And so you certainly would want to refer to a clinician for a longer term recovery process for the actual suicide specific treatment planning and recovery. And you're going to want to, as a mobile crisis team member, communicate with the person's clinician. So if you've been able to create a safety plan with somebody, you certainly wouldn't want, and let's say you get them connected to care, they eventually have someone that's able to follow them more long-term. You don't want them to have to redo that safety plan. That's rough for a community member to have to go through the entire thing again. And so in your documentation, it is really helpful to actually put as much detail as possible, unless there's some special circumstance that doesn't allow you to put the actual safety plan in your documentation. Go ahead and do it so that you can encourage continuity of care there. All right. Now, all of the 6 to 7, if you're including the reasons for living card, all the components of a safety plan. Now, are we done? And the answer is no, but why aren't we done? Why don't you know everything that you need to know? The reason is that the act of doing a safety plan with somebody is the thing that can decrease suicidality. So it's not the act of actually having these 6 components plus reasons for living written down on a piece of paper. That is the effective intervention. It's actually the process that are critical components of doing a safety plan. And let me share just a personal story to kind of illustrate how that's true. I'll share. I have 2 kids. Now they're 10 and 11. But my daughter, when she was very young, she just fell in love with the cello and wanted to play the cello. And so she started taking lessons when she was like 6 years old or something, pretty young, pretty cute, this little cello, that she was playing. And of course, when you're at that age, you're not used to performing in front of other people. And part of her cello teachers, kind of studio or music studio was that they would do different charity events or different performances just to motivate the kids to be able to work together and perform their pieces. So they would, for example, busk on the street and, people would come by and watch them on the street. One of the activities that they did was to perform in a retirement center. So a retirement home or a retirement facility. And I remember this was a Saturday morning. I remember it so clearly that my daughter she had played this particular piece over and over for months. I mean, she could play it with her eyes closed. It sounded pretty decent for, what was, I think she was like 7 at the time or 6 at the time. And we were so busy that I forgot to let her know that she was performing for this retirement or senior home. And so that morning I said, I said to my daughter, shoot, I forgot to tell you at around 1 o'clock today, your cello teacher and all of your cello mates, all of your friends, we're going to go and perform. You're going to perform that piece. It all. That's, you've played it so many times. We're going to perform it for a whole bunch of people. And you're going to bring joy. This is going to be part of their activities for the day. And so I thought, no problem. She'd actually performed that one before in other different events. And so we went there. And I thought that we were going to get basically, a virtuoso, like no problem. She would be an amazing, she'd be so proud of herself, et cetera, et cetera. And what we got instead was something kind of more like this, where she got up there and there were 40, 50 older adults, all in rows, kind of staring at her. She was probably like 3rd or 4th up. And she went there and she froze. And it wasn't one of those, it was like, she messed up a little bit, but it's okay. Don't worry about it. It was one of those, oh my gosh, I just had a nightmare and I showed up to school in my underwear and everybody's staring at me kind of moments, where she played a few notes and then completely froze and could not get started again. And then she's just staring at these 40 to 50 older adults and they're staring back at her. And all of the parents of the performers were staring at each other. And we're just like, what do we do? And I eventually, after not too long, I went and I helped her take her cello off and take her off the stage. And it was one of the, and she was devastated, right? And what I learned subsequently as a parent is that just because she knew the piece, that wasn't enough in terms of preparation. And subsequently I said, okay, I need to be more intentional as a parent. And that never happened again, because for any other subsequent performance, we went through the steps. We lined up our stuffed animals. We had our practice in front of our stuffed animals. Then we went to a Zoom meeting with her grandparents where she would practice there. She would practice every step to say, okay, this is the exact chair you're going to use. You're going to introduce your name and your grade and the name of your piece. And we practice it until she would overcome that anxiety, and that this never happened to her again. And one of the reasons for that and why that's so important is the Edgar Dale's cone of experience, that people generally will retain information and really internalize it, not just when they read or hear things, but when they practice. The more active someone's learning process is and their practice process, the more that they're going to be able to experience it and use it. 10% of people generally remember 10% of what they read, 20% of what they hear, 30% of what they see, et cetera, until the 90% of what they do. So all of that practice for my daughter, that's what she needed to be able to master her kind of cello experience. Everybody, this is so commonly known, Edgar Dale's cone of experience, but then you look at these numbers on the left, and an amusing thing is I said, numbers on my research hat. I said, those numbers look awfully neat. That's a little weird. And so I actually did some digging, and this is actually not evidence-based at all. So this is purely a theory. But I decided, let's go ahead and show it, because this theoretical principle may still hold and be useful. The more someone practices something rather than passively listening, the more likely they retain things. And that applies to the safety planning process as well. So the more that somebody actually practices and engages in that process, the more that they're going to remember it and the more that they're going to use it. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that will look like so that they can get further down that Edgar Dale's cone of experience so that they actually internalize it and use it. And one of the key components of implementation is to discuss the safety plan rationale with the person. Why is it important? The idea is if they understand the rationale, they're more likely to they're going to buy in and they're going to use it. If you're just saying like, hey, let's do the safety planning thing, but they don't really understand why it's important, they're not going to use it, right? And so let me give you a couple of examples that I found really helpful. Another brief story. So this is when I lived in San Francisco, and I lived in, many years ago, I lived in an apartment building, and down the hall from me, it was about 4 stories, if I remember correctly. We were on, I believe, the 3rd story. Down the hall from me was a pharmacy student. And I mentioned what they do because it's a little bit ironic. In that there was this one night, it was about 8 p.m., I remember, because it was already dark at that time of year. It was very cold too. And suddenly the fire alarms went off. And what had happened was that they had a grease fire in their kitchen. And what did they think? Well, they thought, okay, well, fire, immediately you think fire, water. And so what they did was they dumped a whole bunch of water on this grease fire on the stove. And of course, what do we know is going to happen? That's not good. The fire got bigger, it kind of exploded. It triggered the sprinklers, flooded their apartment and the 2 floors below them. From what I understood later on, they were liable for those damages because they had played a role in causing the incident, unfortunately, for a student. But, this is something that we need to actually practice ourselves out of this fight-flight response. Because if you're reacting in the moment, you're like, oh my God, fire, quick, water. You have to actually unprogram yourself to realize that if you're anywhere in the kitchen as a grease fire, you smother or you suffocate, right? And so I've been training my kids If you see a fire in the kitchen, don't put water on it. If it's in the toaster oven, just keep the door closed. It will eventually go out because they'll deprive it of oxygen. And so this, I actually sometimes use this kind of metaphor with folks to explain why we're doing what we're doing. Another example is this, where I might take out a piece of paper and draw this risk arc curve with them and say, okay, what we want to do is that when the hill is small like this, and I'll kind of show them, say, hey, when the hill is small, we want to know exactly what to do so that you can get yourself to a place where you're feeling better when the hill is small, because it's going to be way easier to help yourself feel much better and get out of crisis when the hill is small compared to when you've got a mountain. And these safety, so what I want to do with you is to do this thing called a safety planning process so that we can prepare ahead of time for helping you get back to a place where you're feeling good again and you're out of crisis. And somehow when they're like, oh, okay, and that visual can really help them. And so you're essentially kind of drawing that risk arc for them.
So we saw Dr. Brown explain this very thing, this very concept, and use that opening. So we've got that on that video of him doing it on that you could refer back to. I assume this is going to be the kind of thing where you're doing this frequently enough that you won't need the reference videos for too long, but they're there whenever we need it for a refresher. And again, just going back over in the spirit of this, the intention of this entire process is a person-centered, trauma-informed process that keeps us out of emergency 911 situations that are probably off-putting to the people, probably causing iatrogenic harms, in dissuading people from engaging with the system. If the police are just going to show up and hospitalize me, that's something I would like to avoid. You folks are the face of, yeah, we want to avoid that too, right? So you become a really great resource for them to do this. So there are times when this person-centered, connected kind of approach can feel, I think folks in crisis, mobile crisis, other crisis situations can end up with the compassion fatigue and the things that really pulls us away from this person-centered focus. But it really is going to be, I think, part and parcel of the core of how and why you're approaching folks in this current role. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time hammering some of this stuff home again, right? We've mentioned it before, but here we go. So the client is generating their own ideas. Doesn't mean you can't help brainstorm, doesn't mean you can't educate about, hey, here's some other options I know. Any of that sound familiar to you? And we even recommend having folks write it down for themselves. This skips the whole, you write it down in a way that they don't understand kind of way. It's a whole memory integration boost to have them recording it down. They will have more investment in it if they are writing it down for you. If you have a form, and if in the end of things you have to be filling out your form, then have them be there making a copy. Again, just in the spirit of behavioral practice and behavioral recognition of it. Work through them, work through the plan with them, troubleshoot the plan with them, test the plan, stress test the plan with them, like we talked about before. How might you actually be able to use this plan? Let's say you've got some good triggers or precursors identified, but you don't catch them in time. So you're farther down the road. Is that precursors thing going to be a useful piece to go to? Maybe not. We may need to skip right ahead to section 3, 4, or 5 even before we do that. You're feeling safe right now. You're feeling like things are okay. We can still work on section 6 right now. How do we get it to where your place is safe in general, your situation is safe in general, but you're also ready pretty quickly without a lot of effort if you need to get it more safe, right? To take that. I loved it when Rite Aid was like, we'll now fill 3 months of prescriptions for your medicine because I don't want the pain of running the entire 5 minutes up to Rite Aid and getting my prescription every month. So they'll give me 3 months of prescription. If I've got 3 months of prescription that is part of a means plan for me to hurt myself, then I would rather have that stay down at my sister-in-law's house, and I get a couple of weeks at a time of supply from her, right? So again, really stress testing this idea. Go in with the don't try to present to people that you believe that this safety plan will be infallible. Lean into the inevitable fallibility of the plan and stress test it with them, and tell them, we may need to iterate, we may need to change something, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that the plan failed, it just means we need a better plan. Having them discuss their reasons for living, and this is just kind of time spent in the mental space of connecting to those critical pieces, is just something that will increase the effectiveness of the safety plan. It's a big cognitive shift to get people to bring up their awareness of the good things that they are talking about. We talk about the trauma-informed LIMS, and we do want this to be a guiding piece throughout the process. And this can come in a number of different ways. It can come in back up here where we're talking about folks generating their own ideas. They may have had a terrible experience at a therapist, a hospital, a psych unit, with police. And something that seems like a very good idea to you, you may see not just reactions against, but overreactions against. And to the degree that it's useful, the general recommendation is, go with that. If they're going to overreact or react against something, just accept that as a reality that you're working with right now. If you want to lean in a little bit farther to that, I wonder if there's a traumatic experience back in the past for them, and if it really is a key say resource in my community, and my community's only got a set number of resources. We're not one of these gigantic urban centers, and you want to rule out this resource because you've had a traumatic experience there. We may need to work on that over time. We may need a plan of meeting them or learning about them or making a connection with them, or maybe troubleshooting what it is that went wrong during a traumatic experience. Okay, so that's that thing. The other thing is that one key thing about trauma is anytime you're seeing or having reactions that are trauma based, remember the person's seeking, and this is often subconsciously, even the person is seeking safety. That's probably a copyright violation if I talk too much about that, but the person is pursuing safety, right? So the person is trying to get to safe things, and that's what you want, right? So you should be able to align and be on the team with them about that. Again, we are talking way too much. It's a good place to check in with Avery if you're there. So Avery, just a bit of an orienting question, but feel free to riff on anything here that we've been talking about. What's your take on the importance of trauma-informed perspective for these safety plans?
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. I'm going to repeat a lot of what you said, which is to share, but the goal is to be attentive to why someone might be hesitant or resistant as you're walking through a plan, and understanding that may come from some trauma. So speaking from my experience as a transgender person, many transgender people are really nervous to access services, for example, inpatient hospital services, emergency room services, a variety of different types of clinical settings, both because of personal experiences of discrimination in those settings. The research is very clear, but also because of hearing experiences of friends who share our identities, who've had sometimes very harrowing experiences in those settings. around in a variety of different ways, discrimination showing up in a variety of different ways. So for myself, when I was having someone walk through a safety plan with me, and we got to those kind of more formalized resources towards the end, I'm confident that there was a lot of resistance around accessing some of those services. And so I think your point is a really valid one. And I really appreciated this because I was thinking back to my own experience. I did in fact live in a small town with limited resources. In a place where there was not a lot of culturally specific resources available. And so I think your point of trying to find a way across a period of time to both understand where that resistance may be coming from, but also to find ways to perhaps build trust or build a new narrative about certain resources would be key. But I think the key takeaway is that in general, the best gauge of what is safe for someone is that person themselves. And even if it may be that access, that resource, that person, that place would in fact be safe, if the story that person has in their mind and their kind of bodily reaction to that is that they feel unsafe, then that is their reality in that moment. And so I think, Chris, you said it so well, you have to meet them where they're at, because that is their reality in that moment. So being attentive to that, not meeting their resistance with resistance, right? But accepting that as their reality is really the key to being trauma informed.
Thanks so much, Avery. Yeah, amazing insight. And I am always struck by, as a parent myself, I am always struck by when you run to the end of a situation. A good example I remember is always, you'd buy a new car seat and it says, it's great in all the cars except these cars. And you have one of those cars and it says, don't install this in your car. And you're like, great, but what do I do? Right? Like, what do I do now? Right? So that to me is a little bit of what we're getting at here, and part of the creativity and maybe even the art of crisis intervention a little bit here. Just a couple other quick things before I give it back to my friend Joyce, is just to alert you to some safety tools and tech things. My3 is one of our favorite apps that does safety planning. There are other ones that got taken off the slide, but you can poke around and find a number of different apps that some of them are even locally developed, where folks can do app-based safety planning. If we had you in small groups today, what we wanted to do was to have you all download one or two of these and put your own safety plan in there, just as a bit of an empathy exercise for being able to recommend these apps to clients who might be so inclined. We've got here also too, there are a number of really good resources. For example, this one that's listed for safety planning for people with disabilities and deaf people, where there are some tremendous, very unique challenges to the resources and things available for this group of folks. So way beyond the scope for us to actually cover it today. But wanted to give you a heads up that those resources and things are out there. Lots, many things out there available to help you with whatever challenges you might come up with.
Yeah, and with that, we'd like to show you one last video here of Dr. Brown. So we've talked about all the different main components of a safety plan. We've also now talked about how to implement that in that process. Part of that process is also, talking with the client or talking with your community member about how they can use that safety plan, any barriers that might have. And we wanted to just show you another snippet where they're actually doing the means restriction counseling part. So that sixth part. So you could just see a little bit more of the process and also talking about how they might be able to use that. So.
So the last step of the safety plan is making the environment safe.
Okay.
And by that I mean restricting access to lethal means. That's important because the time between when you start to think about hurting yourself or killing yourself and acting on those thoughts, and if it's a short period of time, that's probably puts you at a higher risk. If the period of time is longer, the less likely you're going to act on those impulses. Your suicide risk curve will come back down.
Okay.
Okay?
That makes sense.
So you talked about the pain medication that you took earlier. Do you still have any pain medication?
I have, yeah, I mean, I have other pain meds.
You have other pain
Yeah.
meds. Do you need it?
No, I mean, I really just keep it around just in case something else happens.
Right. So if we think about having the pain medication, which you might use to harm yourself, versus pain medication, which you might use if you have pain, what do you think we should do?
Probably not having the pain meds around.
I agree. Probably not having the pain meds around. So to do that, my suggestion would be to empty the pill bottles into a baggie.
Okay.
And then throw the pill bottles away, and then put coffee grounds in the baggie or some other garbage that's unappealing. Seal up the baggie and toss it away.
Okay.
Okay? Do you think of any other method of wanting to harm yourself?
Nothing really comes to mind now.
What about firearms? Do you have access to firearms?
No, I mean, that's never been my thing.
No firearms. Okay, so we have two more things I want to talk about. The first is where are you going to keep the safety plan? Now we've filled it out.
Probably better keep it in my wallet.
Okay.
Because otherwise I'm not going to know where it is at any given point. So probably just as well to be with me.
It's kind of a big piece of paper to put in your wallet. Maybe we can write it on a smaller card for you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, sounds good. The last thing I want to talk about is just going over the safety plan again. Remember, it starts with the warning signs, and the warning signs were?
Well, feeling like a failure, being a burden to my family, and definitely the pain.
And the pain, yeah. So that's important for you to remember, so you know to get your safety plan.
Yeah.
If you experience that again.
Okay.
And so then you just start following the steps, things you can do by yourself. You put down home improvement projects, and then if that isn't helpful, you're going to contact your brother.
Yep.
And so on. So now that we filled this out, we've gone over it. What do you think about this plan? Do you think it's helpful?
Yeah, I mean, definitely would have been good to have a couple of days ago, but definitely will help.
Is there anything that might get in the way of you using it?
Not that I can think of.
Yeah, so you think it's likely it's going to be helpful?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, let's write another copy on the cards for you.
Yeah.
And then I'll send you on your merry way.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr.
You're
Brown.
welcome.
I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
All right. So hopefully that was just helpful. And so you saw a lot of the principles that we've been talking about within that video. They've already aligned around the rationale. The person knows why they're doing what they're doing, right? So he referenced the risk arc. They're talking through some of that means restriction. And then you also see they're talking about exactly how you're going to use that, where you're going to keep it, et cetera. Chris gave you some access to some of those tech tools, My3 app. Another app that folks tend to use that's been researched a lot with veterans, for example, is the virtual Hope Box that actually has a Reasons for Living card or a Hope Box that folks use. And some folks with kids and adolescents actually use a physical Hope Box or a Reasons for Living card, but actually a box that they put Reasons for Living in. And on that note, I'd love to talk a little bit about considerations for kids and adolescents. So we've talked, you now know kind of a lot of the just main aspects of safety planning, et cetera. And some of you may be doing this with youth. And typically when you're working with youth, particularly if they're younger, you're going to be also working with their families. And we really wanted to make sure to be able to address some of that as well. So this question of, what does a safety plan look like for a kid? You do certainly start seeing increased deaths by suicide as early as, the age of 10. And it's unusual, but you can see suicide deaths in kids who are younger, but 10 is where we start to see it start to go up a little bit more. And so when you're working with a younger kid, what does it look like to do a safety plan? I want to invite you all to be able to apply some of your own principles about working with kids. If some of you have been trained to work with kids, that applies to importing safety planning over to kids as well. And I'd love to show you an example of what a potential safety plan might look like for an elementary school age kid. So this is an example safety plan of sorts. Some people call this a social story with a third grader who was my daughter. So when she was in third grade, She worked on this as a way to help her get from this angry red monster, right? So she's in crisis here. She's not feeling great. She's activated. She's seeing red. And then as you see, this is through pictures, an equation of how she can get to here, this happy yellow little blob, right? And so she came home and kind of taught in working this through, and I said, "Oh, can you tell me what this is?" And she said, "Oh, well, yeah, when I'm not feeling good or I'm not feeling well, if I can read books, and this is her favorite stuffy. This is a friend who's not." I thought at first her friend was holding 2 loaves of French bread. She loves bread. So I was like, oh yeah, it's very viable that these are loaves of French bread. But no, it's a supportive friend with 2 thumbs up. And she loves chips. She's much more of a salty tooth than a sweet tooth. Her pillow, so her bed. And then this is the best part. I said, well, what is this? I asked her, and she said, oh, that's you, Mommy. And you're giving me a hug. And at first, on a side, I thought my legs were broken or something. And I said, well, what is that on my face? And she said, oh, Mommy, that's a zipper. I said, oh, so is it not helpful when Mommy talks when you're not feeling well? She said, yeah, that's not helpful. I said, oh, you need Mommy to just be quiet when you're not feeling good? She said, yeah. And so that was the best parenting advice that my 3rd grader has ever given me, which is to shut my mouth and not do, this is like the hazard of being the child of a therapist, right? Is they're being talked at. And to this day, she's 10 now, and I absolutely shut my mouth. I don't say anything, and all I do is give her a hug, and it absolutely works. It helps her get back to a lower kind of crisis level, or just a feeling much better. So something you can get creative. You can use your child psychology principles in doing this with children. But it also, when you're working with children, adolescents, and youth, you're also going to be working with other supports. Now, I'm seeing in the Q&A that Minerva McNabb asked the question of, in some of my experiences, not all patients can participate in safety planning due to their severe mental illness. Family and other team members are helpful in some cases. So yes, absolutely. In this case, when you're thinking about youth and children, you need to just by nature involve supports and family members and et cetera. That may also be the case when somebody is in a state where they're not able to, maybe they have an altered state of consciousness, maybe an older adult who has dementia, or someone who has severe mental illness, and they're not oriented to time, place, person. And so during those instances, working with supports can be really, really important. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And one of the examples I want to give you is when you're working with children and youth, oftentimes what is really helpful is working with colors. So this is an example of a risk arc superimposed on 3 different colors that we recommend, which is green, yellow, and red. So kids and youth think, when you can put it in colors, just like what is that game where you're saying like red light, green light, right? That really translates to how they're able to think through a lot of different concepts. And so when you're working with a youth member, you can say, this is where you're feeling good. You're in the green. The green is a go. You're feeling great. And then maybe this is where, you've gotten in trouble at school. Or one of your friends is said something mean to you, or you're feeling bullied. If somebody is an older teenager, or you're having trouble at school, right? And the yellow is when you're not quite feeling green anymore. And in that yellow part, we're going to be talking about what does that look like for your warning signs as is part of safety planning. How do you cope? But in that yellow part, you can use your coping skills to get back to green, right? Again, the risk arc or that curve is smaller. You're talking about that, you're drawing it on a piece of paper. But when you're getting to the red, that you may need some help. When we're seeing red, it's really hard to do it on your own. So developmentally, my kids are 10 and 11, and, being kids of a mental health person, we've talked a lot about coping and done a lot of practice and et cetera. But what I always remind myself as a parent is that they're young. So they often need help to be able to get down from red. So, just my daughter the other day was just kind of worked up, and something that she could absolutely do when she's in green, she needed my help to physically get her over there. And so talking with them about how that when they're in the red and they're at the height of this risk arc curve, let's say you're working with an adolescent here, that they're going to need some help. And so this is an example of a safety plan that's superimposed onto the colors. So once you talk with them about the colors, what you do is you add, so these are the 6 to 7 components. Here's your reasons for living card. Some people call this a hope box intervention. With younger kids, you can actually get a box, get a physical box, put a picture of their guinea pig in there, or of, the person that they feel most safe with. You can put a picture of that person or their favorite stuffy or their blanket into that box. And we've superimposed this onto the colors. And up here, what you'll see is that you're adding adults who will tell when I'm at a 3 or I'm at a red, or what will those adults do when I'm at a 3, right? So if this were to be for my daughter, we would say that I'm an adult that she could tell if she's at a 3. And what will I do? I will stop talking and I will just give her a hug, right? Because that's what she's told me she needs when she's seeing red right here. That's her red right there. She's going to tell me, and I'm going to just hug her. And then we're going to work together with, together to be able to know that when she's at a red, I know exactly what to do. So that's an example for kids. You can, this is just an example of how simple a safety plan can be. I'm going to be talking about these red components in just a bit. Those are culturally adapted components. And this is you can literally just do this on a piece of paper. In this last portion, we're going to be talking about what does it mean to have culturally responsive safety planning. And I do want to recognize that this is more of an innovation or more of a kind of cutting edge area of taking what we've been doing with safety planning for many, many years, and then making sure that we think about the influences, the evidence-based influences of culture and diversity on the safety planning process, especially when we work with culturally diverse folks with different, multiple and intersecting cultural identities. And so Zoe was a client that we wrote up a case study as a demonstration of how culture might affect every aspect of her suicide prevention and recovery process. So I'll just read it out loud, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about Zoe. So Zoe is a Japanese-American military veteran and trans woman in her early 30s with a history of PTSD. She chose to leave the military in order to openly live as a woman, and currently was at the time in which we saw her to do this case study. She was currently a student at community college while living with her mom and grandparents and sister. So it was a multi-generational Japanese-American home. So at home, she lives as a man per request of her parents that she not disclose her true gender identity to her grandparents. So that was actually a pretty complicated process. So she actually understood, she didn't necessarily want to, she understood that her grandparents, that it would be hard for them to be able to absorb her true gender identity. And so she understood it, but that really created some internalized stress for her and also some logistical complications of, if you imagine, living as a woman and then going home to where she lives. And then she has to then change her clothes, take off her makeup before she goes into the house. Right. She also can't do things like legally change her name and have that mail come to her home with a different name on it. And so it presented a lot of different challenges. She denied suicidal ideation on the clinic's intake forms, and she reported a lot of anxiety, fatigue, shame, panic attacks, a very limited friend network at the time. and one past suicide attempt that didn't require medical attention. So Zoe absolutely did a safety planning process, and this was her original safety plan before we took a look. Now, I wasn't Zoe's direct therapist. I was really in the hat of writing up a case study and trying to understand how culture would affect her safety planning process. So this was her original safety plan, and you can see that it has all these different 6 components. And it's a pretty reasonable safety plan, right? Warning signs when she's having repetitive thoughts about death and she's feeling highly emotionally dysregulated. And when she's doing that, can she listen to some either upbeat or soothing music to kind of distract herself? Can she rotate her stress balls and just focus on those stress balls? Meditation can really help, or watching a Netflix show or going for a walk. And then she identified some folks and different people to call when she needs a distraction versus people that she can ask for help, professionals that she can contact during a crisis, and then ways to make her environment safe, including removing access to lethal means and for including medications and et cetera, and just kind of evaluating her environment. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, well, is this safety plan a good fit for Zoe? And what I want to talk about is how this non-culturally infused safety plan had all the different components. She needed a separate reasons for living card as well, or hope box. But for her, this wasn't sufficient. When you didn't culturally infuse some of the cultural concepts into her safety plan. So let me ask you this question of, why is it important to integrate diversity and culture into safety planning? And I want to demonstrate to you how cultural practices and beliefs can affect almost every aspect of the safety plan. And now Chris and I, we've done lots of different trainings on just talking about how culture affects suicide prevention and management from A to Z. And so we're going to take out a little portion of this and try to just give you a snippet of that. But when, for the longest time and still today, suicide prevention and management has been pretty culture void or culture free. And one of the reasons for that is because, for the longest time, you would go to like a suicide prevention conference or something, and you'd see that folks would cite the fact that middle-aged white men have some of the highest rates of suicide other than American Indian and Native American populations. And so a lot of folks would say, well, see these lower rates of suicide for communities of color, so it's not really a culture thing, and then they kind of move on. There are other barriers too of folks just really not knowing how to infuse culture into practice. So, and very few people have really talked about or demonstrated how do you actually culturally infuse our practice around suicide prevention. And when I originally started looking at some of these things with my colleagues was back in 2008. And my mission in life is really to do what we can to decrease suicide and suicide care disparities for underserved populations, including LGBTQ plus communities of color and any other underserved communities. And so back in 2008 or 2007, started wanting to tackle this issue. And we looked around and we saw, there's actually a lot of evidence and a lot of research showing how culture affects suicide prevention. But it was all really disorganized and it looked kind of like gobbledygook. And there was no way in the moments of crisis, especially for you all in your roles as mobile crisis team members, you've got minutes or, you've got a very limited amount of time to figure out how to be culturally responsive. And you can't be like, hold on, let me make sure that I'm doing what the field tells me to do. And let me read 100 articles that tell me different things to do in those moments of crisis. And so what we realized is that the first thing that we needed to do is synthesize that literature that was very disorganized and not theoretically based. And so we created, first thing that we did was to code every single article over a period of 20 years. So we read, it was very laborious, painstaking, hope to never do it again. But we read every single empirical finding to see how does culture actually affect suicide prevention. And what we found was that over a period of 20 years, and we found that 95% of culturally specific suicide risk literature is encompassed by 4 factors. it creates the acronym of MISC, Minority Stress, Idioms of Distress, Social Discord, and Cultural Sanctions, which for me is a really good, it was good news that if I can remember 4 pieces of information, which I can remember 4 pieces of information within a short period of time, I can't remember, 100 pieces of research articles, right? And that MISC, which I'll talk a little bit about as we go through the safety planning, is defined here, that you'll get on slides. Minority stress, for example, are any social stressors that someone experiences as a cultural minority member. And happy to give you the reference for this so that you can read more about what these are. Today, they're known as the cultural theory and model of suicide. And they go along several different principles of looking for the different signs of suicide, understanding that suicide can be precipitated by different stressors, the minority stress and the social discord, and also to look for the meaning of things. That culture and practices and beliefs can affect the meaning of things. And I'm going to demonstrate what that looks like for safety planning. If we had extra time, I actually have a whole, hour-long didactic that I could walk you through this, but just to let you all know, there are some references and resources out there. If you work with youth, there's a cultural theory and model of suicide for youth, so that you can see what are the main cultural factors that I need to consider when working with youth. And an article here that defines all of these different things. Just to let you all know that, for those of you who work in more clinical contexts, or if you want to use some kind of validated instruments within your work, there is a CARS screener. It's called there's a 39-item cultural assessment of risk for suicide screener that assesses for these main cultural factors. It's called the CARS, and this is a 14-item shortened version called the screener. Here's a disclaimer here. It's totally optional. You don't have to use it. This is not necessarily something that a lot of folks have used it, but we just wanted to expose you to it also because we want to show you how Zoe was able to use it in her safety planning. It's free. It's a resource tool. It's developed by me and my colleagues. We don't have any conflicts of interest per se. If you would like access to this, you can take a look at the scoring criteria, et cetera. It's a free resource there for you. But for Zoe, we gave her the CARS, and we gave her the full version. And this is what she elevated on. So she had elevations in family conflict. So there were aspects of her family environments that were increasing her suicide risk. And here there were 2 different elevations of moderate level or higher of what we call idioms of distress, meaning that her suicidal distress was looking different than you might typically expect. So when we might expect that if we ask, hey, have you had thoughts of suicide? That's our standard question that we ask, but actually there's been not as much guidance kind of recognizing that question may not work for somebody for whom their suicidal distress looks more like fatigue and irritation, because there's such high stigma in their family and their context about admitting thoughts of suicide that they either don't know if they trust you and so they don't want to tell you about it, or they've somatized their stress so much that they themselves don't have immediate conscious awareness or psychological awareness about being able to report that. So she had 2 elevations saying like, yeah, she's got other ways in which her suicidal distress is experienced and expressed. And she also had elevations on 2 minority stress scales, which showed that she has significant minority-related stressors. So that's stressors related to her identity, either as Japanese American, as transgender, as a veteran, or the combination of all of those different things, which I'll talk to you about. And so that cheat sheet, Chris and I love cheat sheets. We forgot to tell you, I think, that this blue cheat sheet that we gave you is we designed this cheat sheet to be able to give you in one place what are some example questions that you can ask to be able to assess for all of the different components of a safety plan. So if you're forgetting and you're like kind of in that crisis moment, this is something that you could just have, you can pull out in one different part. So you can say like, oh, let me just ask this general question to ask about each portion of the safety plan. And what you can see in orange is that these are all of the different MISC cultural components, like minority stress can be a warning sign. And that can trigger suicide risks. So as you can see, these cultural factors affect every single part of the safety plan. And I'd like to take just a few minutes to walk you through some of that. So for the first component, the warning signs, I'm going to walk you through conceptually some examples of how culture affects warning signs, and then give you an example of what that looked like for Zoe. This is not to say, as Avery shared in the very beginning, every case is different. This is really to get us to think more broadly about, how does culture affect my work with safety planning? And give you some examples. And this is just for Zoe. It may be different for different folks. When you're thinking about warning signs, so how do I know that I'm getting into trouble? What will actually increase my risk? There's two main cultural concepts that we want to encourage you to think about. The first one is cultural idioms of distress or language of distress. The fact that, hey, my distress may look differently. We know that in some folks, when there's high stigma, there's high shame, they may have a stomach ache rather than sadness and crying. We've all probably met folks who haven't cried for 15 years, but that doesn't mean that they don't feel sad. They just have different expressions of distress, partly because of what their environment has allowed them to do or encouraged them to do over time. And so what does that look like for the people that we're working with and safety planning with? What are their expressions of distress? And also the cultural risk factors of social discord and minority stress. What we've found is that when there are specific culturally laden conflicts within someone's social environment, that can uniquely increase suicide risk. So for example, for an Asian American teen who has intergenerational conflict around interracial dating or around expectations for how well they do at school, and they have, or the duties that they have at home. When I was growing up, I had a good friend of mine who was a Japanese American woman, and loved school, just loved school, and did really well in school. But after school, she could never hang out because one of the kind of aspects that she was required to do at home was to learn how to cook Japanese cooking to prepare herself for a more traditional Japanese American woman role when she grew up, of being able to not only make food, but plate it and make it look beautiful. And so she had to study all of that at home with her mom after school. So, she was limited in being able to go out with her friends because of that. That was an intergenerational conflict that she had a lot of issues with, that was culturally laden. That's an example of social discord. What we know is that when folks are from more collectivistic families, their families may be more of a part of their self-concept, and those family conflicts can present more risk for suicide. What that looks like for Zoe is, her original safety plan before she looked at those cultural factors had the repetitive thoughts about death and high emotional dysregulation. But that actually wasn't when she got into suicide crisis. It was all of these other things. It's when she had to change her clothes to hide her gender identity that she would start to really feel bad about herself. And it would highlight the fact that she had conflict with her family around her gender identity, and then make her question her worth as a person, make her feel not supported by safe others in her environment, or not have safe others in her environment. Whenever others would reject her because of her gender identity. And whenever she had internalized transphobia get triggered. So when other people treated her differently. A note about this, so when you do safety planning and you're working through this with folks, the more concrete you can get, the better. So when you're working through warning signs, say like, oh, people don't accept me, or people are treating me differently. That's really nice and concrete. What that's doing is triggering her internalized transphobia and all of the messages that she's learned about her transgender identity. Zoe was a pretty highly educated. She was in college. she's a pretty highly educated person, and this term, internalized transphobia, really rang true for her. And so she was able to write that down, but generally we do want to get as concrete as possible. And so writing examples down like that is a good thing to think about. And then here is idioms. So those idioms of distress, what she learned and what was that when she felt ashamed or she felt anger, which remember, she is a formerly active military duty man who has just transitioned to being identifying as a Japanese American woman who lives in an intergenerational home in a Japanese American family. Anger is pretty complicated, and how you express anger was pretty complicated for her. What it looked like is that she felt tired a lot. And so this was actually early stages of her feeling suicidal. But if you asked her at this particular phase where she's feeling shame, anger, and tiredness, do you have thoughts of suicide? She would have said no. But actually, this is where she's already approaching yellow right here. So she's already on her risk arc. And so it was important to actually use these as her warning signs, and realizing that, no, she doesn't want to bother folks by saying it's a big deal to say she has thoughts of suicide because she's taking up extra space and she's a collectivistically oriented person. And so she's not, she's like, no, I can deal with it. Don't worry about me. Like, no, I don't have thoughts of suicide, but I feel really tired. Okay. So that has become her cultural idioms of distress. The second category of coping strategies, we want to cue ourselves to think through, are there different cultural practices that are critical on how people cope and heal with suicidal distress? So, when somebody is from a non-emotional, emotionally expressive culture, so Stoicism, for example, there are more Stoic cultures, there's less emotionally expressive cultures. There are some coping strategies that are more accepted than others. What this looked like for Zoe was that for her coping strategies, she ended up saying, okay, well, for my coping, I need to be able to decrease activators of minority stress. So I need to maybe go on a walk to get out of my grandparents' house because, I'm having to conceal my identity. That's really triggering me, and going on a walk is really helpful. Using gender-related positive affirmations. That's in talking through how, leaving, just remember, she had to leave the military to live as her true self because she served during the period of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So if you could think about that huge minority stress of actually having to change your career to be yourself, right? And on her reasons for living card and her coping strategies, she had all of these different components, which wasn't there in the original safety plan, right? It was that she started to actually increase her feeling of self-worth by addressing some of that minority stress. And these coping strategies of strengthening her identity as an advocate was actually what made her get out of crisis. So this included trans activism for VA benefits. She ended up getting rejected for coverage for gender affirming care. And so she had to go and get other insurance to be able to get gender affirming care. And she became empowered as an activist for that, getting hope for gender affirmation surgery by exploring those other insurance coverages, hope for marriage as her identified gender, and then also going to graduate school to become a therapist for the LGBTQ plus community became her career. She ended up giving a lot of talks about our experiences to help folks, learn from her own experiences. And then this also was under coping strategies of remembering that she didn't want to make her family deal with her body if she died by suicide. She didn't want to burden or shame her family, and helping her remember that. That also went into kind of her thinking through her means, and what stopped her from actually doing that is that I don't want to burden and shame my family with that. And that was really helpful for her as a protection in coping and getting her from red down to yellow as well. When you look at either social contexts and settings for distraction, and also people that she can ask for help and professionals that she can contact. It can be important to think about how culturally safe and affirming are those different contacts and settings. And also this is the same thing, right? So if I'm going to contact a professional, then is that person safe? Are they accepting of me? And or are they triggering my trauma, right? And what are my cultural preferences for help and cultural differences in the help seeking process? And this is something you can prompt them. So it's very powerful when you say, hey, let's talk about people that you can ask for help when you're in crisis. Do you feel safe around them? Are they, do they accept you for who you are? And when you ask that question, you are passing the test and understanding that their cultural identities and their cultural experiences are critical to helping them get to a safe space. You're not changing what the basic aspects of the safety plan are. You're respecting the fact that their cultural identities affect every single aspect of that safety plan. There are clear evidence-based differences in preferences for help between folks. Folks with higher stigma and different communities of color in suicidal crises, research has found that they prefer more medical or non-professional sources of help as a first line of care, partly because of the stigma associated with mental health professionals. There are a lot of different sources of help, and there are a lot of people that can help. And so oftentimes getting someone the support that they are comfortable seeking out can be really, really important. And also we know that folks with higher stigma and different communities of color, they take longer to seek help. They wait until it's more severe. And so that process can be elongated, and you may need to spend extra time talking with them about their concerns. Are there any questions that you have about reaching out for help? Do you have any questions about talking to me and where this information is going to go? Do you need to, is it helpful to talk about who will find out if you talk to me about some of these things? Right? And talking to them about basic confidentiality, talking to them about what suicide is and mental health is. Those are things that we know that extended psychoeducation process is a critical component of a lot of folks who aren't familiar with mental health and suicide. And that happens to fall along ethnic identity lines oftentimes, or other situations where there's high stigma. And then so for Zoe, what that looked like was not just 3 people, right? So, but just imagine, so Zoe's getting triggered by when she has to change out of her clothes just to be able to go home. But if one of the people that she can ask for help just does, kind of thinks that, hey, maybe Zoe's just going through a phase and this is not her true gender identity, that's actually just going to trigger her more. So it was important to think through, like, hey, let's make sure that you have a friend who knows your true gender identity and who is safe and will be able to talk you through this, when you're in a time of crisis, and help you during that time. If you're using an app with Zoe, and talking, and I saw all the chats talking through the safety of, what you put in those apps, knowing that data is a thing, right? Data sharing is a thing. You might have them put the shining picture of a face in that app so that that person who knows their true identity and is a safe and affirming person is smiling and looking at you, right, when you're using that app. The professionals that they can contact during a crisis, Zoe added an LGBTQ+ veteran support group that she worked with her therapist to find, and also the Trevor Project. So the 988 hotline, she just felt more comfortable being able to talk to and call the Trevor Project lifeline. All right, and the last component, making the environment safe, is can you consider cultural preferences and cultural meanings of different suicide means? So there's not a lot of research out there to understand what are some of the different cultural preferences for means, but we do know that there are patterns. So in some data, for example, you see many communities of color, you see more suicide deaths by hanging rather than by firearm because of some of them. Okay, and then consider how family and others are involved in collaborating to make the environment safe. So for Zoe, that included specifying the ally status of the environment, removing alcohol. Somebody had asked earlier in a chat, that what is the role of danger to self and substances? And alcohol can absolutely be an accelerant. It can be part of a warning sign. It can increase risk. And that can also be part of making the environment safe. And with that, hopefully that gives you an example of what how to think through some of those cultural concepts. And I want to ping it over to Avery to talk through some of her experiences. Can you talk to us, Avery, about whether it's been important to you to integrate your own cultural identities and experiences into your safety plans, and what does that look like?
Thank you so much, Joyce. One thing I want to note too as we get started, and I really appreciated the case study that you just shared with us and all the insight about how that impacted the safety planning. One thing I want to note is that in a pilot program with 988, that folks, when they call 988 now, they have the option to speak to an LGBT competent specific counselor. So there's a pilot program with the Trevor Project and some other call centers that have received specific training. So just for general knowledge, it's good to know that you actually can advise folks to go to 988, and then they can select a different number to access some of those resources. Something that many of us have been campaigning for many years. So really exciting to see that happen with the hard work of folks at SAMHSA. So, a few things that I would offer just in addition to Joyce's excellent comments on this topic is, Dr. Joyner's theory, the psychological theory of suicide, talks about the intersection of the vector of feeling like you're a burden and feeling alone. And, as Joyce so eloquently said, when you're thinking about working with so many diverse populations, you couldn't possibly understand everyone's nuances because of their culture or because of the identities that they hold. So for me, I think what we're doing is talking broadly about an approach about how you stay curious and attentive to how culture and identities are constantly a part of this process that you're engaged in with this individual. And particularly as it relates to the whys, why might that person be experiencing feelings of burdensomeness? Why might they be feeling alone or having experiences of being alone? That curiosity is key, because the answers that you receive when you're going through the safety planning process may be very different than you expected. And I think you saw that in the example that Joyce shared. That certainly would have been true for me as well, right? That given my context, the replies may have been very different than the person walking through a safety plan with me would have expected. And so the key is really your approach of meeting someone where they're at, understanding that the responses to these questions may be different than you expected because of their cultural identities, and being willing to meet that person where they're at. And that's the beginning of helping someone feel less alone tangibly in this process, which is one of your hoped for outcomes, right? And feel tangibly like they are less of a burden, which is part of what you're helping to do through this entire process. And I think the last thing I would say, and I think that the case study that we just had really illustrated this so beautifully, and my own story does this as well, is to be very attentive to intersectionality. I think it is a very common mistake of many of us, and it's very easy to do, right? When someone is presenting with one particular identity that might be complex, and we know from literature or data or research contributes to a higher risk for suicide for a variety of reasons, say, for example, a transgender person, to minimize or not think about other identities that may be at play. So like in my own example, religion played a really significant part, and religious cultural identity. I came from a collectivist culture because of the religion that I was raised in, that was very closed and very collectivist. And so at some points, minimizing that would have certainly done me harm, and did. So I think the necessity of thinking intersectionally at all points about all the identities that someone is bringing to the table and how that is playing out in an iterative way throughout the safety planning process is really key.
We just wanted to kind of end this with an encouragement to, as you safety plan, and maybe even for those veterans out there who've done years of safety planning, I think you can probably see there is a cultural push that we need to look at in many of our communities, particularly in a place as diverse as California, to actually grow these cultural considerations into our safety planning. We can also push and think about other ways we could have educated other adjacent people and empowering them to safety plan, teaching the parents to safety plan, teaching the family to safety plan. Safety planning probably has a little bit more tendrils on it than you're leveraging right now, probably. And one way to find that out is just the idea of debriefing and troubleshooting every single time that you're doing a plan as much as you can do it, right? And I love the orientation of this series to forcing yourself under the assumption that every person we work with, even the most, quote unquote, combative or non-participative person, is a person who is credible, capable, and intuitive, and who is able to collaborate, and for some reason is choosing not to with you, right? So what can you do differently? What can you do? Well, how can you not just repeat whatever cycle has sent them to the negative reactions that you're seeing when that's the case, right? So just with the person, if it's possible, or even just after the fact as a team, sitting down and troubleshooting. And there are a couple of just different thoughts there about ways to start picking apart troubleshooting. I love the analogy of, I think of the analogy of Navy pilots who have to land on ships, which sounds terrifying. And it doesn't matter if you've been landing on ships for 1 year or for 20 years, you go in and debrief every landing, and they rate you and they score you, and you debrief it every time. So let's adopt some kind of model like that. And I think we can extend into a lot of growth and this really cool opportunity that you all have to really shift what it means to be in crisis as a Californian. So I think that's the goal here. With that, then, our content is wrapped up. Avery, any last comments? Anything?
No, nothing really from me other than just saying thank you for allowing me to participate in this. I think it's really important to have the voice of lived experience. So thanks for allowing me to be a part.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Avery. We're going to open it up for Q&A in just a moment. This is a summary of what we learned today. And hopefully you've got, hopefully a good overview of different skills and knowledge around crisis safety planning with cultural infusion. We want to encourage you to practice. So take some of the tools that we've tried to give you, some tools, some cheat sheets, et cetera, so that you can have them by your side. And there's nothing better than practicing it. You can practice it with yourself. If you don't have your own safety plan, safety planning is something that everybody can do and everybody can have. If you don't have one yourself, start there. Create your own safety plan so you can think through that as your first practice. And with that, Chris, I think we have a question here.
Yeah, one popped up about the use of, or the taking the firearms from folks, but would it be possible for you all to use that as the mobile crisis team and say, well, I'm an individual, so you can give it to me in that kind of situation? And my knee-jerk reaction is screaming no. And then I'm also realizing that I am just potentially taking away a tool from you. So there are a couple of reasons why I think it's not the best idea, unless short of you're a law enforcement probably, or a firearms dealer. The one is that the law technically to me reads as an individual can do that. So if I, Chris Weaver, am out there responding as a mobile crisis team leader, but I invoke that law, it's not mobile crisis team Chris that took it, it's Chris Weaver, the person who took it legally. So that's just, I know enough about that to say, hey, watch out, that seems kind of fraught to use it for that. But it's a really interesting and intriguing idea that it might be worth asking relevant counsel or somebody.
With that, any other questions? Any other thoughts?
I'll say two. They'll probably won't want me advertising them. Talk to your good folks up at Humboldt. I saw some folks in the room here, but they're doing some really innovative stuff up there, partnering with gun shops in terms of safe storage.
Yeah, Minerva, to the question regarding the apps recommended, are they HIPAA compliant? And I I'm going to go with no, but we actually don't know for sure. Chris,
Probably not. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's in the safety plan doesn't necessarily include information that is HIPAA sensitive, other than that I have downloaded a safety plan. I have all of these on my phone, right? So I am flagged by everybody. I get constant reminders that everything is okay and call 988. Because I have all of these on there. So I think it's an education thing of just letting folks know, hey, you might want to filter what you're putting in here.
And also just remember that HIPAA is going to be in relation to a healthcare provider and protected health information. These safety planning apps are for the community member or the clients by the community member and client. So you are not arbitrating in any way their use of that safety planning app. That is totally their choice for them only. And so HIPAA compliance actually may, in that scenario, not even come into play. What will come into play is their own data security. So
and most of the apps, the ones that we've sent you to, are also organizations that aren't looking to profit off of the data, hopefully.
Yeah. So you shouldn't be helping them or sponsoring them the use of that app, and so therefore the HIPAA compliance shouldn't come into play. Yeah, Lucy, great comment. Folks should look into how apps protect user privacy and data before recommending them. Agree 1000%.
The only thing I would add to that is those things are also subject to change. I think that educating people about the risk of their data getting out there is actually always good, even if you read something and were confident at any period in time.
Yeah, and there are ways to input. What are your warning signs? Oftentimes, people will know, hey, I can put kind of a code word for myself, kind of like when you do your password reminder. So if my password reminder is my piano teacher, I can just put keys, right? And I'll know what I'm talking about. You could say keys, and I'll know that means that my coping strategy is to play the piano because I'm a piano player. And, that's a way to kind of still have my safety plan there. But if I'm concerned about data security, then I'll know what that is. And I will know what that is. All right. As you all think about other questions and other comments, I'll put these prompts up to just kind of prompt you to think about one thing you learned. Because really, when you come away from a training, a lot of it goes out the other ear, and we totally recognize that. But if you were to think right now and either write it down or put it in the chat, what's one or two things that you are going to take away from today? And also just to reflect on what are next steps for you or your program in your own safety planning practice. Is there like a group meeting or a team meeting that you can take this back to talk about how you're going to actually use whatever you learned from today in your actual practice?
Thank you so much, Joyce, Chris, and Avery. You all presented amazing information, and everyone, is speaking about the things they've learned today, as well as just highlighting some of the key cultural components and pieces you spoke to and highlighted and gave examples, very concrete information and easy to just go out and apply in the field. I feel, I no longer work on a mobile crisis team, but I feel like if I did, I could easily take all of this and apply it in the work that I do. So thank you so much. Avery, thank you so much for sharing your own lived experiences and just really highlighting what you went through. And thank you for your work and trying to ease the pain for others who are going through what you went through or who will go through what you went through. And so just appreciate you very much. And everyone here is also acknowledging how valuable it was to hear your experiences. And so thank you. Again, very happy to share space with you all today. I know it's a long training, but we appreciate you sticking around and really taking the time to interact and engage in the training.
Good luck, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Reach out if we can be of assistance. Really great spending the morning with you. Thank you so much. I just saw, as folks are logging off, I saw a question from Carlos. Will addictions ever be considered a subculture of these important matters? We deal with a number of clients with such severe addictions that lead to danger to self. Absolutely. I think it already is considered a subculture. And you know your community best. So if that is a lot of folks consider that a cultural identity of theirs, is related to addiction, related to substance use. And there is a very unique culture around that. And I think a lot of the principles that we've discussed apply there as well. Substance use interacts with and affects everything that we do in suicide prevention from A to Z. And yeah, I'd love to.
For what it's worth, our early days, front edge, but my students and I are looking at replicating some of Joyce's work at the MISC on PTSD, so cultural theory and model of PTSD. And we are starting early days to wonder if substance abuse is an idiom of distress, of how people are expressing that stress.
Yes.
Integrally tied.
Absolutely. We already know that substance use is a potential idiom of distress across gender identity lines. For folks who identify as men more than women, you'll see that depression is more common amongst women. A lot of folks think of the substance as an idiom of distress of depression. So yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks everybody. Sorry for that last minute comment. And thanks Carlos for that last minute question. Have a great day. Hope you all have an amazing lunch. My favorite is Indian food. I hope someone out there is having Indian food. Or falafel. I love falafel.